quite the room. I'm very excited here to talk today. We're very lucky to have Dr. Joel Yoon, who has been traveling quite a lot in the last few days, and not even the last leg on his journey, but we're very lucky to have him with us today at Queen's University. He is a research fellow and deputy head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. His research focuses on regionalism, integration, security, and intervention norms, focusing on ASEAN and its dialogue partners, as well as the European Union. He began his career in international affairs working in Uganda on peace, conflict, and refugee issues. He has also worked in the private sector in Singapore in public and investor relations. He is presently in the Singapore Committee for the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. And he's also the author of Contesting Sovereignty, Power and Practice in Africa and Southeast Asia with Cambridge University Press. So we're very lucky to have him today. And let's give him a round of applause before he begins his talk. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, so, thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've had quite a bit of a journey, so I hope you don't mind if I'm a little bit disjointed. And again, sorry for having to cut short, but I have to catch a train right after this. So I'll try to keep it brief. I have to confess, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say at this point in time. And the reason for that is there's two distinct ways in which this conversation could go. So it all depends on you, which is I'd like to ask first and foremost, I work in Asia, and we're at the epicenter of geopolitical competition, particularly between the US and China. And so we have quite a different view about this because China is our next door neighbor. And at the same time, I've just come from the Halifax Security Forum, which was a great event, wonderful people as well. But they're very convinced that China is a new or part of the global threat to peace. So they've come up with an acronym called the CRINCs: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And they suggest that these are the greatest threats to democracy and world peace. So I would like to ask you for a start. You can see the topic of my presentation is about confidence building measures. And what I was worried about was, do they even want to talk about this here? So my question is, should the US and China improve their bilateral relation, or should the US press China harder and perhaps be more confrontational about China's undermining of the international order? So what do you think? Maybe if I may start the conversation this way.
All right, let's go at it.
Yeah, thank you.
Colonel Mike Down, I'm a visiting defense. Sorry. Hey, sir, thanks for being here. I'm Colonel Mike Down. I'm a visiting defense fellow here at Queen's University from the Canadian Armed Forces. Well, it would be my personal opinion is that we have tried that over the last 30 years, building a closer economic relationship with China, which seemed promising 10, 20 years ago, and has resulted in a massive military buildup in China that is concerning to the rest of the world right now. So it appears that building a closer relationship only resulted in building a very large military in China with aggressive ambitions across the world. So I think it would make me nervous to try and go back that route. So okay. It seems like containment might be the best way to prevent further buildup, in my opinion.
Right. Any other
counterpoint?
Not so much a counterpoint necessarily, but more to add. Ian Garner, I teach Russian foreign policy here, and I'm also a center at the fellow at the center rather. Just to build on that, thinking from the Russian perspective, and you mentioned Russia, we've seen that the build-up of bilateral links with Russia actually really didn't work. And over the last 20 years, when Russia said that it intended to invade and subjugate its neighbors, that's what it was going to do, and indeed what it was doing. So I'd be really interested to know your thoughts about how things might go differently potentially over the next few years with China. But I'm very open to being persuaded in any direction.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. So now I will use version 2 of my talk. No, it's okay. We live in the Asia-Pacific. Perhaps it's a own type of bubble of its own, actually. But because, as I mentioned, China is our neighbor, we have a lot of different views about how the China relationship works. So primarily, the thing that we can't control in the policy space is economic and business ties, right? These are made on a daily basis by businesses and individuals who want to trade with China or and so on, and so such that China's trading relations with all of us in Southeast Asia is, I think China is the #1 trading partner of all of the Southeast Asian countries. They surpassed the US, which tended to be the #1 for most countries in the last 10 years, including Singapore, Malaysia, and so on. So the states of Southeast Asia have a difficult problem because the choice has already been made on the economic front by businesses. On the other hand, on defense and security, we have perhaps a bit more space to work with China, but we're also cognizant of the hazards that come with some of this, right? So let me start with a story. In 2016, the Philippines won their case against China on at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague on Chinese claims to the South China Sea. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And they were always going to win because China had already elected, at the minute that the Philippines had elected to prosecute the case, that they would not recognize The Hague, the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And so they didn't even raise a defense. They simply said, we don't recognize the jurisdiction of the court. And so the court took only a one-sided set of inputs from the Philippines and, of course, ruled strongly in favor of the Philippines at the end of it. Now, Singapore, my country, issued a curious statement in support of international law. It was relatively, innocuous of a statement, but basically said the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, it is the guiding principle for these sorts of jurisdiction, no questions, and therefore it supported the ruling. As a result of this, we got into a lot of hot water with China, right? They'll not officially, but unofficially, what happened very soon after was that we have military training exercises with the Republic of China, that's Taiwan. And some of these armored cars that were coming back from Taiwan traditionally make a stop in Hong Kong, and they were impounded there for reasons that were not clear. So we almost lost 20 armored cars to China. And what the fallout of that was really that China was unhappy with us taking a side in that case with the Philippines. And so China has this issue with the region where they make all of these great sounding statements. They're designed to attract the support of the regional members. But when push comes to shove, when it comes to the actual specifics, incidences, or sort of the policy practical questions, China's actions tend to be very differently perceived because they're so confrontational. So we've had the South China Sea question in our region for 30 years, and we've never made progress on a code of conduct on the South China Sea. So this was supposed to be the 10 Southeast Asian members of ASEAN with China developing a code for how they would interact with each other and resolve the dispute. This is not even about resolving the dispute, it's how to resolve the dispute. And that code of conduct has had absolutely no progress in the last 20 years, since the Declaration of Conduct, which was 2002 or 3. And so we still have to deal with China because on the economic front, we're so close to them. At the same time, on the security front, we've had so many differences. And the question is, how can we bridge this effectively? So for Southeast Asian states, we had built an inclusive, accommodating regional architecture. It was formed at the end of the Cold War. There was an optimism that differences could be overcome. As you mentioned, we were trying to bring China into the fold, right? So the initial hope was that much like the way the Allies had brought Germany, Italy, and Japan in after World War II, the former communist states in Eastern Europe after the Cold War, there was the hope that China would be able to be brought in. And yet China did something different from the other examples, which was that it drew a very strong and clear line between its political integration or liberalization and its economic liberalization. So the economic side of things liberalized. China went from being a communist system to a capitalist one. At the same time, its political system remained very staunchly communist in style. And so even within the economic structures, there were difficulties because some of the controls over private firms were retained by the state. So one, China's state-run industries is far outsized compared to almost any other economy. Two, the even entirely privately run firms have to have a close relationship with the Communist Party of China. And those that do not, as we've recently been seeing examples of, get, well, we don't know exactly what happens to them, but they get questioned by the authorities. So this distinction with the capitalism with Chinese characteristics, as the Chinese would say, it was very hard to overcome. I mean, businesses in Southeast Asia already knew that it's easy to invest in China, but it's really hard to get money out of China. So if you wanted to take your profits, not so easy. And the more China had clamped down, the more difficult it was for businesses. So businesses are now, well, partly due to the economic turmoil in China, which is largely driven by property development that has gone wrong. Businesses are also now, international businesses are now reticent to invest further in China. So this then gives China a problem, which is that its domestic political space is rather insecure because it's going through very significant economic turmoil. And we know from history that insecure leaders tend to be a bit more bellicose, right? So they be a bit more confrontational externally to sort of make up for their weaknesses internally. And so this is the situation we find ourselves in. We think, on the one hand, China is has a difficult domestic situation, and at the same time, its posture is rather confrontational at the moment. That said, of course, things that are going on in the rest of the world are also significant. The US elections are coming up. We don't know how that's going to affect the relationship, but we need to, from our Southeast Asian perspective, we need to stabilize as much as possible because the world keeps getting more and more unstable, or the insecurity of the region is getting worse and worse. And if you think about after a war in Europe, a war in the Middle East, and several wars in Africa, we can't afford a war in the Pacific, right? And so we're still thinking about how to deal with confidence building measures, right? So finally coming to my talk, or to the confidence building measure part. The idea of confidence building measures were outlined in a paper for the ASEAN Regional Forum in 1994. And as you can imagine, that was the post-Cold War era. China was at the still kind of isolated after Tiananmen, but the ex-Eastern Bloc or Soviet states, and in our region that mean countries like Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and potentially Myanmar, were now being integrated into our region. So the optimists among them, and I think most people shared that at that time, was that if we could come up with confidence building measures that would integrate these actors in, we would be able to develop a stable and secure region. Now, the trouble, of course, was that China, as I've already described, chose to opt out of certain key elements of this integration compared to the rest. Now, if you look at Vietnam, for example, although they have actually very, very similar characteristics with China, they have gone all in with the regional integration. They're one of the strong promoters of regional integration in the Southeast Asian region. They need ASEAN as much as the rest of us do, right? It's their safety valve with China as well. But China has not done that. So what's happened, or what is the situation with confidence building measures now? One, the Cold War model didn't work. The ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum paper, which outlined all the types of confidence building measures, never amounted to enough to actually transform the relationship. So there were things like sharing of information, joint exercises, arms registers, and so on, right? Not all of them even got implemented. Not all of them got done. But the main thing was that at the bilateral level, none of them actually amounted to a sufficient set of conditions to change, to fundamentally transform relations. And so, with the U.S.-China rivalry worsening, and I would put the real decline with the start of the Trump administration, right? So in 2016, Donald Trump throws the Trans-Pacific Partnership out, or pulls the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then embarks on a trade war with China. And this cycle of tit-for-tat comes across increasingly well. Each time you have a tit and a tat, the escalation is just a tiny incremental bit worse than the last one. And so the Biden administration that came in did not fundamentally change that policy towards China. The trade war continues. You still got almost in fact, more entrenched kind of policies on, especially on strategic components. And then the prospects for reversing this appear to be bleak. Now, there is one hope, and I think the idea of tit for tat that has developed out of game theory is one of the reasons why I think there's hope. So in game theory, I don't think I need to explain to this crowd the prisoner's dilemma, right? So in game theory, tit for tat was found to be one of the most effective strategies for playing the game of prisoner's dilemma over multiple rounds. And the reason why that happens is because prisoners, the hypothetical prisoners, lack a communication system between themselves, right? But their problem in the prisoner's dilemma is fundamentally a coordination problem. So tit for tat was a form of communication, right? So if you cooperate, you're communicating to the prisoner that the other prisoner that they can also cooperate. But if you defect, you're communicating to that prisoner that you're going to defect. So it has both a vicious cycle, a version of it is both a vicious cycle and a virtuous cycle, right? So cooperative measures can be interpreted as that and promote a virtuous cycle of cooperation. On the other hand, defections or hostile measures lead to the descent. And it doesn't seem like there's much in between, right? So what's happened with the US and China? Now, as you mentioned, China's initial sort of playing of the game in terms of being brought into the system, getting a lot of the benefits, but just marginally working to reserve space for the authorities to manage their capital political system and their economic systems, and therefore often transgressing in very small minor ways on businesses or in the South China Sea and so on, was, I think, the beginnings of a descent, a tit-for-tat descent, where China was essentially defecting and not upholding their commitments to the liberal international order that they were benefiting from, right? And then it was starting an escalationary cycle, but very, very slow and very, very incremental. Now, on the other hand, the problem with cooperation was that too few elements could be understood or immediately recognized as what is a cooperative action. So what is something that we can do when you do something good? How can we respond? And there's always the question of trust here, because trust that this action is not a one-off, it's not a ploy or some kind of duplicitous scheme, is essential to actually for promoting the virtuous cycle version of tit for tat, and that is missing right now. So my final point then is about confidence building measures. So confidence building measures need to be rethought in this particular age, because the central element of tit for tat, which I think is a very effective strategy. I do not blame either the US or China for using it. But it needs to be able to work on the virtuous cycle as well as the downward spiral. And confidence building measures are the key mechanism for that to work. Because if you cannot trust the other side, you cannot then reciprocate positive cooperative actions. So what does that mean for actual confidence building measures? If you look at the ARF paper on what the actual confidence building measures they propose, they're not, as I've already mentioned, they're not sufficient to actually transform relations. So I think, and one of the things that they did mention was meeting at summits and deeper personal engagements. And I think the APEC summit that was just recently concluded is a potential first step, right? So that was the first time in at least 5 years, I think, that I said this summit ended with the US and China's relationship actually improving. Every other summit I had observed up to that point, it was either no change or worse. And so there is some element of this, but the question is, how can we, if we believe that the US relationship with China needs to improve, how can we expand on these confidence building measures right now? Okay, so I don't have an answer to that question, unfortunately, but I do think we need to rethink these confidence building measures, make them deeper, bring in more economic elements to the cooperation, and also try to avoid some of the more hostile possible measures in retaliation. Okay, so thank you. I'll be happy to take questions now.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this presentation and this talk. I'm going to open the floor to the crowd here and at home for questions. If anyone wants to start with a question.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to sit there. All right. So second question for today is, as much as I understand why Southeast Asian nations need to work with their neighbor, as we all do anywhere in the world, you need to figure out how to work with your neighbors. And my question is, the relationship with China in the Western Europe and in North America is as we discover more and more of the Chinese system tentacles, we're not convinced that it's possible to fix this when their intentions are clearly not good. And the spying network, the underground police stations across our country that police Chinese citizens in this country. I'd be curious to know if that reality is starting to sink in your country as well, or is it different? Are they more aggressive to countries farther away from them than they are to their immediate neighbors, because it's not in their advantage either to to have a too negative of a relationship with their immediate neighbors. Is that a reality that Southeast Asian nations are starting to be aware of? And do you see any way out other than confrontation and containment to stop it?
Okay, that's a great question. I think there is a difference. That one of our think tanks in Singapore did a kind of discursive analysis of Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy. You all know what wolf warriors are. It's, I think, based on a movie about how the Chinese have to fight ferociously to defend themselves, and so it carried into diplomacy where good diplomats were wolf warriors. They're very assertive, and so quite often you find that the Chinese on Chinese diplomats in their official capacities on social media will hit the West, particularly be critical about whatever is the most recent controversy. But this think tank in Singapore did an analysis of this, and they found that while that was true for the West, wolf warrior diplomacy was very, very much more tame in Southeast Asia. That means they were treating Southeast Asia differently. They would hit Southeast Asian states on particular contentious issues like the South China Sea. So they would frequently criticize Philippine or Vietnamese activities there, but everywhere else it was always sort of best behavior kind of rhetoric. And so on the surface level, there is a little bit of a qualitative difference. Now, you also mentioned the more nefarious stuff that goes below the visible levels. And I think Chinese foreign influence is a fact. They're using, for example, diaspora Chinese communities. I'm Chinese, by the way, in Singapore, Southeast Asia, to try to influence favorable viewpoints about the People's Republic of China, and that is not it's not so obvious exactly how that destabilizes. I mean, it's basically a positive view of China, but it could, in a country like Singapore, which is very multicultural, it could upset sort of the racial dynamics, especially if the Chinese were to start to get very nationalistic about it, right? Or buy into some sort of ethno superiority complex, right? So there's also that level. But the one thing I think, or the saving grace, is that because China is so hierarchical and so authoritarian, when the leader signals a shift, they do actually follow down the line. And we need to press that shift to be more sustained, right? So Xi Jinping, towards the end of COVID, as COVID was starting to die down, he actually told his wolf warriors to tone it down. And I'm not sure if they've toned it down, but if you look at his appointments of diplomats after that message, you find that it was not always the most aggressive and assertive speakers who took the top positions in their foreign ministry, for example. So some kinds of change are necessary, but they can be actually promoted with this because of China's hierarchical structure. The question is, can we get it to get them to do it?
Perfect. I'm going to ask a question from Thomas Hughes, who's with us online. He asked, so to just read what he said. Your suggestion of deepening the confidence building measures is really interesting. Do you think that this is a case of improving the confidence building measure regime by giving more information in the existing areas where those confidence building measures already exist, or by expanding the breadth of the information, even if at a surface level?
Okay, so some of the things that were done were needed to go further. So for example, military exercises, especially around disaster relief, I think they tended to they could have more could have been done, but I mean, disaster relief is expensive. It's always in an emergency situation, and sometimes it blows over very quickly. So it's not always easy to sustain it. Some kinds of things like that, but other things that were never done, right? So an arms register, I don't think that ever happened. The nature of summits, engagements, in Southeast Asia, we do that, but the external partners outside of the region tend to view them a little bit equivocally. So they don't always see the point of why ASEAN likes these meetings. They don't understand our culture. In Southeast Asia, showing up is actually really important. It doesn't even matter if there's any substantive talk, but in Europe or the West, if there's no substantive deliverables, then they think it's a waste of time, right? So this cultural divide is quite problematic. We got upset over the recent ASEAN summit because Biden didn't show up, but Biden would not understand how that actually affected the views towards the U.S. from this perspective of Southeast Asia, and maybe we don't matter enough for him to care. So that's these sort of cultural distinctions need to be understood a little bit better. At the same time, I can agree that Southeast Asia has not done that great a job. We're not doing a good job on Myanmar. We're not doing a good job with confidence building measures, and we're maybe a little bit too timid on many things, right? The difficulty with some of these things is that nobody wants to. I guess it's better to fail a little than fail a lot, right? And nobody wants to take that sort of more ambitious step, which has a higher chance of bigger failure, in order to address some of these tricky problems. So therefore, this ends up being the kind of status quo in our region.
Perfect. Thank you. Is there any more questions from the room? Yes.
Thank you. I'm curious about the state of mind of the Chinese people. Not that it's a monolith, I appreciate, but it was interesting to observe COVID and from what reports we got, and how eventually there was a rebellion, as I understand it. And I'm just wondering if, and the building of a market economy, as you've described, if a middle-class segment of the Chinese population is a deterrent to confidence building, or is it an asset to confidence building within China, within the Chinese leadership?
Okay. I'm not an expert on Chinese domestic politics, and I only speak a little bit anecdotally here, but there are a couple of things that definitely broke through at the national level. One of them, of course, is, yes, the COVID protests, right? They decided that they were not having these ridiculous lockdown measures anymore. I mean, basically being imprisoned in their own homes. The second one that has also come through is this lie down movement. I don't know if you've heard of this in China, where basically it's kind of a millennial Gen Z kind of resistance to, you're being told to pursue material wealth and success all the time, and then they're realizing that the structural conditions are actually so innately against them. I think it's happened here in the West and Europe as well, that they give up trying. And so lying down is the idea that I'm just going to sit on my couch and survive rather than try for these goals that are unreachable. And the reason is that in China right now, the economic troubles are really, really bad. It may not seep through perhaps outside of the region, but they're in really big economic trouble right now. There are properties that they can't even finish building. leaving people in debts to houses they cannot actually move into, and no sort of economic. They expected this mantra, build it and they will come, has not happened. They built it. Well, then they ran out of money. Then they didn't finish it, and nobody's going to come to an unfinished building, right? So the Chinese economy is in very bad shape. It doesn't show because other parts of China still growing. So the like sort of the big number figures still look reasonable. But in various parts of China, you'll find that the economy is in the slumps. International businesses don't want to invest there anymore, and a lot of it is down to their own actions, which is, if you look at this, these new security laws, businesses are upset with these security laws, not because it's some sort of pro-democracy stance, but because they can't do due diligence anymore, or they might be considered to be spying, right? So if you can't find out where the money came from because you might be accused of spying, then how do you ascertain that you're not doing money laundering, right? So a lot of these problems that China has right now are really difficult, very complex, and stuck between various different conditions that are not easy to solve. I think the image of Chinese nationalism as being very driven by a sort of young, economically optimistic population, which I think 5-10 years ago was probably the case, is very different now. That's not to say that they don't have nationalists. They obviously do, but there's a much more complex picture coming out of China now.
Thank you. Maybe building on that answer about, you mentioned the fact that essentially that the Chinese economy is not going as well as it used to be. It's starting affecting the population. You mentioned in your talk earlier how an insecure government with a population that's less satisfied tends to be more aggressive. Maybe the obvious flashpoint that you didn't mention at that point, but that came immediately to my mind is, of course, the elephant in the room when we talk about China, the US, and the Indo-Pacific. It's always Taiwan.
Yep.
And so my question to you would be over what would be the perspective of other states such as Singapore, if there's the flashpoint that everyone is predicting that will happen over Taiwan. How, from your perspective, could that eventually be mitigated through confidence-building measures? And just generally how to approach that situation as we move forward, maybe in a direction that's less desirable on that front.
Okay. Well, my personal view on Taiwan is that it will depend on how Taiwan fights. So if there were, if you think about the Ukraine conflict, the first 72 hours, people were thinking Ukraine's going to be the next Afghanistan. It's going to roll over. Don't send any arms because they'll be basically handing them to Putin at that point, right? So instead, Ukraine showed a completely different stomach for the fight, and now it's a completely different kind of conflict. Taiwan is, I think, in a similar situation, right? It's all hypothetical. Taiwan has not fought a war since the Chinese Civil War, right? And how they're going to respond is entirely going to be only going to be known in the first 72 to 40 hours or so. It's not an easy place to attack. So if China were to build up a force to attack it, we would know quite a lot in advance. So there would be that. There would be I think it would be a lot harder, than Putin doing a sort of military exercises in the woods for China to conceal anything of that scale. And we also think that an island is a fortress. It's going to be very hard to invade, given the number of landable beaches Taiwan has, which is very few. That said, now one question I get asked is what would be the regional response? So Southeast Asia is very close to Taiwan. Clearly, a conflict would affect us very negatively. The trade in the region would be completely disrupted. China and Taiwan are both incredibly critical economies to all of us, and so we would all hurt. At the same time, the cost of getting involved would probably be too great for most of these states. We cannot afford to take a side on that conflict, and therefore, much like the way, and actually much worse than the divisions that have emanated over the response to the Ukraine conflict, Southeast Asian states are going to be much more divided about the Taiwanese one, and the kind of excuse that it's an internal affair would probably be enough cause for inaction, right? So I don't want to make a choice. So therefore, I'm going to consider an internal affair, and that absolves me from the responsibility.
Thank you. I think we maybe have time for one short question. If anyone in the room wants to ask one last short question.
Sure, follow up basically. So if we assume that an easing of the tension is not going to work, if we assume that some form of bipolar world will grow into a containment policy of some sort, at some point, countries around China will feel pressured to pick a side, right? As they have in the last Cold War. And if in that respect, I could see two things. One is because you have economic ties with China, they would be forced into China's sphere of influence. Or China will crack down in making sure that nobody leaves their sphere of influence, and then the level of aggression in their region, they'll go from being nicer to their neighbors and harder on the West to being a lot harder on their neighbors to make sure that it's not an option to leave. Where do you see that? Like your opinion on that?
Okay.
As a local resident, thank you.
I don't know. Our mantra has been we don't want to make a choice. We've been trying to deny that inevitability. The thing about what I said earlier about the economic choice isn't made by us. It's made by millions of individuals doing business and making personal or individual company decisions on a daily basis. Right? Where are you going to get your parts from? Where are you going to do your provide services to, and so on. Right? So economically, China will be the heavyweight, right? The more of the decision making will go toward China, and the U.S. is unfortunately not putting market access on the Indo-Pacific economic framework, and therefore the benefit of the U.S. is sort of more abstract. Right? Not in arms. In arms, the U.S. is still probably the most important for Singapore, certainly the most important security partner. But for things like the liberal international order or rules-based order, it's a very abstract concept, right? Whereas the business ties are tangible and real on a day-to-day basis. So if they are democracies, they're going to vote with, they're going to make decisions based on where their people want them to lean. And that would probably be on the business end of things, closer to China. It's only if they're autocracies, countries like Vietnam, for example, that actually have the option to, or much more likely to tell the businesses that are doing trade with China to rein it in. It won't be an easy choice.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today. Please join me in applauding our guest today and thanking him for this very interesting talk.
Thank you very much.